Hello, everyone, and welcome to ICLR's Friday Forum. Today we have the privilege to have Dr. Czaijowski with us, who's from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and he's going to present on the work undertaken by a team of researchers from the Wharton School, which has been assessing how stronger and well-enforced building codes can reduce wind-related property losses. So Dr. Czaijowski serves as the Managing Director for the Wharton Risk Management and Decision Processes Center. He conducts research on economic and risk-related issues of natural hazards and oversees grant-supported sponsored research and corporate sponsorship. He has served on 2 committees of the National Research Council of the National Academy of Science, the World Economic Forum, Academic Advisory Board, and the Department of Homeland Security Research Review Board. So without further ado, I'll let Dr. Czaijowski present on the topic.
Okay, thank you, Sophie, and thank you to everyone who's joining. I hope you find the information useful, and I look forward to your questions at the end. I'll just make one slight correction to Sophie's intro. This is work that's a series of papers I'll be presenting here, kind of a relatively high level, but the work has been done in conjunction with my colleagues, Kevin Simmons, he's actually at Austin College, and then in a school in Texas, and then James Doan, who's he's a climatologist. He works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. And so it's this team of myself and Kevin as economists, and James coming from the scientific physical science modeling community that I think has helped to make the work valuable. So just to give you an outline of what I'm going to be presenting, I'll start out with a general context and approach to how we're thinking about this problem. Trying to understand the value of stronger and well-enforced building codes. And then I'll walk you through some primary results that focus on the state of Florida and looking at understanding the implementation of their statewide building code in 2002 and what that meant for them after that, following from a number of events after that time frame. And then importantly, we're going to do a benefit cost analysis of the code. And then there's going to be, I'll go through some extensions of the work, including trying to understand the role of local enforcement in communities beyond sort of the implementation of this overall statewide code. And this is a general framework that we'll use for our modeling, and it might be familiar to some of you who are on the call. I mean, this is essentially the primary components of a catastrophe model, where you have the hazard, in this case, hurricanes or wind, and then the exposure in terms of the buildings that are impacted by those. And then this notion of how vulnerable this exposure is to the hazard. And the combination of these 3 elements then is how the modeling achieves losses. And what we're interested in understanding here is specifically around this notion of vulnerability. If you do reduce the vulnerability of your exposure through more advanced building codes, then what does that mean in terms of the losses that result? And so building codes they're frequently, having stronger building codes in place is frequently touted as something that should be done, right? That this is an effective risk reduction strategy and sort of this cornerstone of resilience. But even though that's sort of out there, you still see images such as the 2 that are presented here, which are related to the work that I'll discuss today. So you have, of course, Hurricane Michael, which just came through the panhandle of Florida last month. And then the bottom slide is for Moore, Oklahoma. And my colleague Kevin and also Paul Kovacs from ICLR have done some work on that as well. So, of course, there is the codes only apply to new construction, not to sort of a lot of the existing construction that's been in place, but in regard to the codes themselves, there's a lot of variety. So this is especially true, in the U.S., where codes are implemented at the state or a locality level. And so there's been sort of a push towards trying to make building codes more uniform, either within a state or across states through the adoption of model codes such as the International Residential Code, the IRC. And this is just some data here to give you a sense of the variety of the codes that are in place. So for these 1 to 2 family dwellings, which is what we're concentrated on in this work, we're not looking at commercial losses. 36% of states in the U.S. do not adhere to sort of a uniform statewide residential building code standard. So you could think about that in terms of geography, right, and in terms of space, but then you can also look at that in terms of time. So codes themselves are updated every 3 years. So these model codes come out with new codes on a 3-year cycles, but there's a lag in terms of how those are then implemented by the states. And this has gotten better over time, but you can see here, this data is per May 2018, whether 51% of the states are using an edition of the IRC that's at least 6 years old, right? So they're 6 years behind the best science, and of course it's only going to, again, impact homes moving forward, but you sort of have that going backward in time as well. So even though there's for new construction, there's still a lot of variety in how the code is being implemented, and of course, having codes put into place, having these stronger, more well-enforced codes put into place does increase the cost of construction, right? So it makes construction more expensive at the margin. And so this is kind of the argument against having these more stringent codes in place, is that, well, it makes housing less affordable for people. And so the way that we've tried to attack this problem, or this issue, I should say, is that we're trying to understand, well, what do you get back for putting these codes in place? What are the losses that are avoided from having stronger, more well-enforced codes in place? And then importantly, how does that compare in terms of the cost of implementing that? So in Florida, the primary emphasis here, at least in this first part, on data in Florida. We wanted to understand an area that has a strong statewide code in place, and Florida is often held up as sort of the gold standard for this in the U.S., but it hasn't always been that way. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, even though there were strong codes in place for South Florida at that time, what they saw was that these were not enforced well at all, and we'll come back to that in a little bit in the slide deck. And so then after following Andrew, they put into place, to enhance the code and to make it well enforced. And basically in 2002, the Florida Building Code, the FBC, was implemented statewide. Now, I will say that there was some slack in that up in the Panhandle around the area there where Hurricane Michael did hit recently. So there was some. The code was not. There was some legislative give and take there, and up and through 2007, right? So although a lot of the other homes in Florida, and almost all the other homes in Florida, were following the code after early 2000s, there was a lag in that portion of the state, which we put out an op-ed around this and regarding what this would have meant for sort of increased losses because of that. And I will say, actually, last week, the former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, was here at the Risk Center, and he opened up a conference for our folks and talked a little bit about that, because he was in office during that time. And again, he came back to this idea of affordability, and so he had called it, this area of the state, as the forgotten coast, and that they had tried to give some ease on the increased cost of construction in that area. So given that, though, this notion of, say, post 2000, 2001, 2002, that's what we're going to try to isolate in our analysis. So we want to look at what is the impact on homes that were built after 2000 and those before, and what do losses look like between those two decades of construction, which is basically the data that we're working with. So that's the part of the methodology here. You can look at the raw data and you can get a sense of that, and you might have seen some other reports that do that, but we wanted to basically run statistical modeling of this so that we're also controlling for all the other aspects of what could drive losses, and we'll come back to that CAP modeling framework here in the next slide to understand specifically what is the impact of having this post-2000 construction given windstorm losses from 2001 to 2010 in the state of Florida, and we want to look at pre-2000 construction versus post-2000. So from this framework, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and loss, we do have loss data that we were able to get from the Insurance Services Office, ISO, which is a subsidiary of Verisk. So they gave us their realized insurance claim data over the years 2001 to 2010. So that's what we're going to be modeling. And this is just an example of what that data looks like in natural logs over time. And you can see, of course, sort of the blips in 2004 and 2005, which were the very heavy hurricane years in the state of Florida. I believe it was 7 hurricanes that came through during that time frame, maybe 8, I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But besides that, though, we're looking at about $5 billion worth of insured losses during this time frame, and we have over 300,000 claims that we're looking at across nearly 900,000 exposures. So from a data perspective, I think we have a pretty good data set to be working with, although we're looking at this at an aggregate level in terms of zip codes that were impacted from an annualized basis. So there are some limitations with the data, but we are at least working with realized claim information for about, we believe, about 40 to 50% of the market share during that time frame. So that's the loss data, and then, of course, a big driver of losses is the hazard itself, and we were focused here on building in wind speed as well as duration. We have some other work that shows that these are important in terms of driving losses, not just sort of the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale, Cat 1 through 5, which is primarily around wind speed. And so this is where James Doan, importantly, plays a key role in our work here. And there were 18 storms that happened in Florida during that time frame. And this is just a picture, obviously, of their tracks and kind of the areas of the state that they hit, which is pretty comprehensive. So we're collecting data on that, and then basically capturing that from this National Center for Environmental Prediction hazard data that's available on these. It's gridded data, and we're putting that to the zip code level over time so that we can use that in the analysis to try to understand that its role as a driver of the exposure loss. So from the exposure standpoint, we're looking at, these are just some of the variables included: housing unit density, right? You would expect that the higher and the more dense that the zip code is, that the higher the losses would be. Whether or not mobile homes are present there, and by how much, again, sort of a driver of loss. Higher income, there's been some work showing that that could lead to lower hurricane losses due to people sort of self-protecting, but not necessarily all the time. Of course, the more policies that are in place, the total premiums are a function of the value of the home, as well as just the number of claims. And then from a vulnerability perspective, outside of the year of construction, the decade data that we have, which is we also got from ISO, and we have some other vulnerability factors in terms of building construction, but we're looking at what could be a risk factor in terms of the zip code, whether that be that they're a coastal county versus an inland county. We're trying to understand, of course, during this time frame, a lot of the market was transferred to the residual wind pool and citizens, and how much of that was transferred over, which would be sort of an indication of maybe a more risky area because insurers would be less willing to underwrite there. And so we're trying to control for that in the modeling too. So, we're building all this in, we're looking at this over time and for storms, and at the end, the papers are available, and I'm not going to get into all the details of the modeling here, but we're looking at this natural log of losses as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, time and space, fixed effects, and a whole host of other statistical factors and analyses that we ran. But basically, the one that's highlighted is whether or not the home was built after the implementation of the Florida Building Code. And so by isolating that in our regression model, we're able to find that having this FBC in place reduces losses by as much as 72% as compared to the pre-2000 homes. And there's been some other work that's been done on this. Again, maybe not to the extent that we have done in terms of our modeling, or just they have different types of data, but generally that 40 to say 75% reduction in losses is a fairly standard result in terms of having new construction in place versus the old construction. So we feel pretty good with the results that we're getting in regard to the implementation of the Florida Building Code. And again, maybe that's not so much of a surprise because you sort of hear that touted all the time, but really where we wanted to take this in the next step was, well, given that you're seeing this reduction in losses, how economically effective is this to do that, right? So coming back to the point from the beginning where this whole idea of whether or not putting building codes into place is affordable, there's a cost to implementing the new code. And so we wanted to understand the reduction in losses in regard to that cost to understand the economic effectiveness of the code itself. So this is just the kind of a high level way of thinking about this. So we have this $5 billion in losses, and nearly 4.8 of that is from homes that were built prior to 2000. So we derived this sort of straightforward average annual loss, simply dividing that by 10, or $479 million per year, okay, as an average annual loss. And so then we take this out over time, and for these, assuming, for these homes built to prior 2000, assuming this life of 50% and all these adjustments for inflation, et cetera, and we get a present value of future losses of 22 billion off of this 4.8 billion over the next 50 years. Now, I just had said in the previous slide, or a couple of slides ago, that the loss amount that we had found was about 72%, and that this typical range is around 40 to 60. Here we're just taking this conservative estimate. Well, if you had, instead, if these homes had been built to the better code and you had a 29% loss reduction, this would lead to reduced losses of 6.4 billion. So that's sort of this. If the codes had been, if these exposures had been built to a stronger code, you would have saved 6.4 billion over the lifetime of these homes. And so then we wanted to compare this in terms of, well, what would it cost you to do that? So what would it cost you to move the pre-2000 to the 2000 to meet the FPC standards? And we got this cost data from an Applied Research Associates study from 2002, and roughly, the cost per square foot to meet the FPC is about $1.50. And we, did sensitivity analyses around these, and there's nearly 800,000 homes that would need to do this at an average square foot around 2,200. And then this costs an additional 2.8 billion to meet the codes. So just by looking at it that way, right, this is giving you back $2.25, a BC ratio of 2.25, or for every dollar spent on the implementation of the FBC, $2.25 was saved in the form of reduced windstorm losses. So anything greater than 1 from an economic perspective is meant to be economically effective, right? It has this benefit cost ratio that's greater than 1, and we're showing that here. And in the paper, again, we go through a whole host of scenarios to test the sensitivity of these results. And we find that, on average, these are across all these scenarios anywhere from 2 to 6 or 2 to 7.93, this BC ratio. And maybe some of you have seen there's been other work that's out there from the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council. It used to be a 4 to 1 savings is what they had shown, and then they had a recent update just this past year, I believe, and they had it to 6 to 1. So our estimates are falling within there. And the other way that we thought about this too is, well, if you have this reduction in losses, how long does it take to get the cost paid back? And it's about 8 to 9 years. So the main point here is that these BC ratios are typically greater than 1, and we show, as others have, that having these stronger codes in place pays for itself. This is just a quick snapshot of a study that Kevin and Paul Kovacs and let me see, just Kevin and Paul are on this one. I know there's some other papers that they have. We're looking at Moore, Oklahoma. So after the Moore tornadoes, they had implemented a stronger code there, and you can kind of abstract away from this direct versus full. It's just different aspects of the modeling in terms of whether we're only looking at homes that had losses themselves or looking at the entire impacted area, which is the full reduction. But basically, again, we still see that in this is in Oklahoma, and these are codes that were not for hurricane, but for tornado, that there's this economic effectiveness that BC ratios of 3 to 4 to build to stronger construction to meet the standards to protect yourselves from tornadoes. And of course, coming back to this affordability question, the concern would be also that there would be a drop off in housing starts or housing built in different areas, and so they put together this. They were looking at Norman versus Moore. So in Norman, Oklahoma, there was no new code that was put into place, and in Moore, with the new code being put into place, there wasn't shown to be this. By comparing the two housing markets together, there wasn't shown to be this drop off in housing sales. So this is an important point in regard to, again, this affordability or cost question. How can you show sort of the value of these codes, right? So they're economically effective, but do people want this type of building? And at least in the Moore case, they show that that's what's happening. Excuse me there for 1 second. So I'll just go through some other highlights of some of the other work that we had done in three buckets here, and then the last one is on the focus of the local implementation with the codes. So the previous analysis was looking at the overall statewide effect, and it was sort of a blended view of Florida, and this isn't the most recent version, but the state itself has different wind design speeds, right, outside of the code, and there is some correlation, obviously, between the two. But the wind design does vary across the state. So we were interested in understanding what that would mean in terms of the reduction of losses and its economic effectiveness. So we ran the sort of similar analyses accounting for whether or not the area, what wind design speed it was built to. And so over here, you can see these are sort of the values that we saw for the state overall, which again are kind of in this 4 to 6 range. And then this is the non-windborne windborne debris region of the state, which is primarily the interior. And then the state also has 2 windborne debris regions, which are primarily coastal, and they have different types of aspects, coverings, or window glazes that can be implemented as part of the code. And so, again, we're still seeing overall that the economic effectiveness of these, because these, that $1.50 per square foot of cost was a blended amount that I had shown you before. And depending upon the non-windborne debris region or the windborne debris region with these certain types of coverings for the windows, these are different cost amounts. And we still see the cost effectiveness, or the economic effectiveness, excuse me, of in these regions. But this is one where these glazed windows are a bit more expensive on a cost per square foot. And so you can see here that this is approaching the $1 BC cost, or the one BC cost ratio, where its economic effectiveness starts to come into question. I will say also, though, in this paper that we looked at this these values accounting for climate change. So we wanted to understand, because we're, if you think back to the example, we're taking this over a 50-year lifetime, and so we're trying to understand how the winds characteristics can change within that time frame in terms of the intensity of storms, the distribution shifting more to the right. And so, that value with higher intense storms does go up beyond that 1 BC cost ratio 1. And then also, we thought it would be interesting to kind of look at other factors on the hazard side, which we are accounting for already within some of the work in terms of wind speed as well as duration. But trying to understand that in relation to the codes, because again, our understanding is that the codes are primarily built around the wind speed aspect, but of course, the duration or the size of the storm also plays a critical role. So you might have a sort of a very large storm that stays there for a long time and isn't at a really high wind speed, but can still cause a lot of damage. Or you could have sort of this fast-moving storm that hits a more narrow area, and sort of the damage aspects of this can be different as well. So we've been trying to understand how these sort of parameters of the wind field can impact the drivers of losses. And so this is another paper that is referenced at the end, and we do find that the code does well, first of all, we find that all of these things matter in terms of drivers of losses, but that the code, even though it's not necessarily designed for duration of winds or directional uniformity or steadiness is what we're calling it, that the code does still take that into account and reduce losses for those particular aspects. So the last thing that I'll go through here in detail is around this whole notion of enforcement. So even when you have a strong statewide code in place, codes are primarily maintained at a local level. So it's always really this sort of an open question as to how well at the local level codes are enforced, sometimes implemented, right? So, and this is what came out of Hurricane Andrew in 1992. So they did have a strong code on the books in South Florida at that time, but unfortunately they realized that it wasn't being adhered to at all. And these are the quotes here. Andrew exposed how low standards for construction and poor enforcement by inspectors led to destruction and disaster. It's not just the code that's important, it's making sure that the code is enforced. And so this was, a big emphasis in Florida following that. And so what we're trying to understand here in these analyses are not only, we call it sort of this extent of the code being implemented post 2002, or this 2000 decade of construction, working with the data that we have, not just the extensive margin, but also on the intensive margin at the local level, how well the better enforcement of codes relates to disaster losses from tropical cyclones and wind. And so we use also from ISO the Building Code Effectiveness Grading Schedule data, or BCEGS, to get at this. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the BCEGS, since 1995, ISO has been administering the BCEGS in the US. I apologize to any ISO representatives that might be on the line if these numbers are out of date or if I'm misstating anything here, but approximately 17,000 code jurisdictions have been rated by ISO. They have a BCEGS rating from 1 to 10, where a rating of 1 is the best, right? It's this exemplary enforcement of a model code. And before the communities can be rated, they do have to have some minimum requirements in place. And so you'll see here later on that there are some communities that don't get a rating just because they're not even meeting these minimum requirements, and other communities might just choose not to be rated from ISO in terms of the BCEGS program. And then beyond these minimum requirements, there's this whole ranking system around the administration and enforcement of the codes, review of building plans, field inspections, etc. So the codes themselves on a 1 to 10 basis are a blend of both adoption of the code as well as the local enforcement within a jurisdiction. So that's what we're using to try to get at how this matters in Florida. And this is a snapshot from 1995 to 2015 of all the different ratings that we received from ISO. And so what you should first notice here is that even though Florida has this gold standard of strong statewide code, that there are a number of areas that do much better at implementing the code than others. Right, so it's not that every single community in Florida is a 1 because they have this really strong statewide code. There's still a lot of variety within the state. You can come back to the Panhandle exemption that I had talked about earlier, up until 2007, and so we're sort of placing these different ratings into buckets that we called more favorable and less favorable, and we did work with ISO to try to get the proper discretization of these ratings. So we're looking at more favorable in comparison to less favorable, as well as anything beyond a 7, these 8, 9s, or 10s, or whether or not they're not even there's no rating at all. And these things change over time, okay, that the communities get rated just as the codes themselves are changing over time with the 3-year cycles, at least from the model code perspective. So this is just to give you a flavor, just for 2005, a snapshot of losses, and those are the gray areas, I believe. Sorry, my screen is cut off here at the bottom. And so I'm just, no, excuse me. The gray areas are the 2000 BCEGS ratings that are 1 to 3. So more the more favorable ratings, those are the gray shaded parts. And then the blue are where you see a lot of losses that have greater than 10 million in total losses. So you could see that there are high losses in highly effective or highly enforced building code areas, but also there are large losses in parts that are less effective, right? So of course, a lot of the losses are going to be in highly populated areas, and so oftentimes the more highly populated areas are going to have more of an incentive, not necessarily always, but they could potentially have more of an incentive to have better enforcement at the local level because they have more capacity to do so. So again, we're trying to just sort of understand where what the role is of this local enforcement in regard to the loss. So we're going to go through the same sort of hazard exposure, vulnerability to loss sort of estimation framework. And now not only are we including the year of construction decade, but we also have the BCEGS rating over time for that particular community. So we're trying to isolate that as well within the modeling framework. And the first purple bullet up here is, as we talked about before, windstorm losses are shown to be reduced by as much as 72%. This is sort of the extensive margin, right, which we had already talked about, the implementation of the code, which is still the driving factor. But we do find that an additional 15% of loss reduction has occurred to have more favorable BCEGS ratings in place. And so the takeaway from this is that while the local enforcement might not matter as much as the implementation of a statewide code, and that can certainly sort of change over time, but while it might not matter as much, at least initially, it still does matter, and that there's a benefit to having better enforcement at the local level. And we've shown this also in other contexts, and this is kind of where some of this work started out. This is a picture of the state of Missouri, where we did a similar analysis. Here, though, we were looking at hail losses. And again, we're using the BCEGS rating less than 4, right? Again, the lower is the better in terms of better enforcement and adoption, and then greater than 5 in red, and then the purple being not rated. So we, even, and this is in Missouri again, you're going to have a lot of variability within the state, kind of more than you do in Florida, because this is a particular state that doesn't have a statewide code in place, at least it didn't at the time of this study, but a lot of it's left up to the local jurisdiction. So there's a lot of variety here within the state. And again, we found that this mattered in this analysis, and it was on the order of 10 to 20%. So in line with the 15% estimate that we're finding in Florida. And then there's just sort of this 6 million annual savings across 4,000 impact homes due to this better enforcement, right? So that's kind of, again, sort of a flavor of what that would mean for different jurisdictions or communities. So, my concluding comments, and I just have kind of a couple of other slides here at the end, but I think our research has shown that building codes are not only effective in reducing the losses, but they also do this in an economically effective way, which is very important, as we talked about, because if you're trying to have support for having stronger codes in place in a community, the argument most often against that is the increased cost of construction and what that would mean for affordability of homes. So we're trying to show that these are economically effective, or not to show that, but to understand whether or not they are or they aren't. And I will point out too that we're only looking at direct property losses here. There are a lot of other benefits to having avoided losses in place, a lot of other external benefits, potentially premium discounts and just other things in the community that matter that we're not picking up here. So it's just sort of another aspect of this economically effective argument. And the second point here, although it's not as substantial as the implementation of, say, a strong statewide code, intensively implementing building codes at the local level, meaning having better enforcement in place, does matter as well. And I'll just come back to sort of at the beginning, even though this, we've shown this and we sort of feel that this is an important, idea to have promoted, we still see a lot of variation across the country. And really the sort of optimal level of enforcement hasn't been achieved, even in these high-risk disaster areas such as Florida, where you still see a lot of variation. And again, I'll come back to the Hurricane Michael example that had this exemption for various various reasons through 2007. This is not necessarily a plug for Verisk, which AAR is also a subsidiary of them. They're a cat modeler, but it's just, for us, we've been trying to understand the role of codes and kind of coming back to this cat modeling framework within the hazard exposure vulnerability and loss framework. And AAR does have an emphasis on this in their cat modeling. And so, we've had conversations with them about our work, and it's just, this work is meant to inform kind of what those, reductions, might look like from a vulnerability curve perspective within that sort of modeling environment. I believe this is my last slide, and I've given you kind of a high-level overview of a whole host of papers that we've published on this. And if you're looking for, more details, I'm happy to take some questions now. I don't know how much detail I'm going to get into on some of these, but you can certainly download the papers from the links that are here or email me offline. I'm happy to have conversations with folks as well. So thank you again. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and I guess we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Jeff. This was a great presentation and certainly a topic of great interest for ICLR. So I'm going to get started with the questions, and we have a few questions on the line, but meanwhile, if you have any additional questions, it's not too late to ask them, so please feel free to type them down in the question box. So I will start with a two-part question. So first, are you planning to expand this work to other hazards or other states to see how it compares with the findings you had for the wind-related losses in Florida? And do you believe that the method used for the study of building codes in Florida could be applied for, say, wildfire building codes in California?
So the quick answer to the first question is yes, we would love to do that. We've been in conversations with ISO to get some other data, and really a big reason for that is because Florida, right, might not be, in one way it's a great test case, in other ways it might not be, because it's such a strong statewide code, right? It is the gold standard. So we'd love to get into other highly impacted hurricane areas along the Gulf Coast or the eastern coast of the US, where there is a lot of variety in the codes, and to understand what these numbers look like. And we imagine, like I would say, for example, the enforcement might become a bit more important in other states where the statewide code isn't as strong and the wind design standards aren't as strong. So that's something we definitely want to do. A key thing for that is getting the data to do that. We're in conversations with ISO to get that done. But again, if anyone on the line has something, that would be great. And then the second part, yeah, for other hazards, I mean, we did this for hail. I'm not as familiar with codes for wildfire, but obviously that would be a really interesting study to do as well, given kind of everything that's going on here in the news recently, and also in the past few years. So I think the methodology that we used, this hazard exposure vulnerability laws, I think is a good one, and I think it's generic enough, as long as you can get the data to expand it to other geographic areas and other disaster types, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. A question from Paul on the line. So support for stronger building codes is difficult in Canada. One issue is that Canada does not have frequent, very severe events like hurricanes in Florida. What advice do you have for those seeking to champion stronger building codes where the frequency is lower?
Right. So, I mean, that's, a good question. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I think that would be part of looking at some of the other states where the hurricane severity the frequency again might not be as great, but maybe approaching some of what you might have in Florida. And I mean, really though, we're interested in also understanding whether or not like this economic effectiveness information, how relevant that is for regulators or for decision makers around codes. So again, we've heard that the cost aspect is a key driver here, but whether or not when you show people the economic effectiveness of these things and we're trying to promote this work, how much of a difference that makes, I'm not really sure. So I somewhat also alluded to that the fact that there are other benefits beyond just direct property losses when you're thinking about building codes. And so this, not to take this off into a tangent, but this whole notion of resiliency for communities. So you want to think about beyond just property damage and insured property damage and what these losses would mean, whether that's for communities over time or other aspects to losses beyond property. And I think when you get into these lower probability environments, once you start to account for the true scope of these events occurring, not just their timing, then or their frequency, excuse me, then I think that would make a big difference.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question on the line. Have you done any research on the topic in the Canadian context?
Nope, not yet. But hopefully, with ICLR, we would be able to partner on something again. Looking at using this framework that was presented here, and Kevin Simmons, my colleague, I know he had spent some time in Canada on a sabbatical, and he might have done some work there, but I'm not. I can't be certain off the top of my head. I know that they were, he's already partnered with Paul and some of his colleagues at ICLR, so I don't know the extent of the work in Canada, but it would be interesting to do that for sure.
Okay, thank you. Another question on the line. What is the role you see for the insurance industry in promoting loss prevention building codes and the enforcement of codes?
So it's huge. I mean, and in fact, they understand this quite readily, and that's why they have built these facilities such as as IBHS, Institute for Business, Home and Safety, where they have developed all this great science around having stronger codes or retrofit measures in place and what that would mean in terms of the damage to the homes. And so I think our work is really kind of an extension of that, where we're sort of calibrating this information with, with actual data that's been realized from events. But they understand that. So IBHS is an insurance industry sponsored entity. I think they have 90 or plus insurers that sponsor that. And there are a number of other facilities like that that have insurance industry support. And, this whole notion of risk reduction, whether that be through codes or retrofit mitigation or better land use planning, this is critical because in these high-risk areas, especially in coastal parts of the U.S., if risk reduction measures aren't taken into place, it sort of makes these areas less insurable. And so the insurance industry understands that, and they're doing a lot of work around that. I would say one key thing here is that oftentimes having these codes and better codes in place or doing retrofit mitigation measures leads to some sort of premium discount. And these have been mandated by states and through CAP modeling exercises or other things. And so I think this work sort of helps inform that, because trying to understand what really that reduction looks like and what that premium reduction looks like is very important. So I don't think any insurers would be giving 72% reductions off of policies, but I believe in some states they are as high as they're mandated to give as high as 50 to 60% and for these better ratings.
Okay, thank you. A question, so following the publication of your research, have you seen any change happening in Florida in terms of enforcement, or how did you manage dealing with the Ministry of Housing? Like, were there any changes on that level?
So this is the key trick here in getting research into practice, and this was I mentioned Governor Bush. This was the theme of our conference, and so we're trying to make more of a discerned effort at doing that. And I would say that we haven't sort of presented this work to regulators or to others in the state. We assume that there are other groups that have advertised our work or promoted it, I should say. But like I said, we've written some op-eds, but this isn't something that we've kind of been on the ground promoting. Maybe some other organizations are better suited to do that. I will say, though, that some of the language that we have used is, there were some talks that in Florida, especially, that they might try to make the code a bit less restrictive than where it was. And so we've kind of argued like this would not necessarily be the best idea. And this kind of comes back to the first question, where it would be nice to sort of go to other states like Texas, where the code is significantly different, right, on the opposite end of the spectrum with Florida. And I think, this type of work might make more of a difference. But that's a long answer, but the short answer is we haven't done a lot on the ground getting in front of groups, but we'd be happy to do that if there was a way for us to facilitate that.
Okay, thank you. You have shared research assessing the value of better construction to new buildings. Are you aware of research assessing the cost effectiveness of renovation to existing homes?
So there hasn't been as much on that. There's been some studies that have looked at retrofitting these existing homes, because that is a big crux of the problem of where we are today, right? And even in the data in Florida, I mean, there's still, the codes only are for new construction or significant modifications, greater than 50% of rebuild of a house. And so the existing construction is the really tricky issue. And I will say there hasn't been as much work done on that. We have not personally looked at the mitigation side. There are some studies that are out there, and the benefit cost ratios they're not as good. Part of the reason for that is just because at the margin, putting this better construction into place when the house is being built is just less expensive to do so. So the retrofitting it's a bit more expensive, and I can say in other contexts, like say for flood, it's not that easy to do, or it's not even possible, right? There are just certain structures that can't be elevated, and this would be a big sort of mitigation technique to be done. But I think there's,
thank you.
yeah, sorry, quickly, that I just think that there's a lot more work needs to be done with that.
Yeah, okay. And following up on this question on a similar topic, have there been studies on the impact of codes and code enforcement for commercial buildings?
I'm just not sure. I think I've seen some papers looking at the Texas wind pool and the impact on commercial properties. But I haven't really seen anything off the top of my head on commercial, but that's something that we had tried. We do have some commercial loss data, and we tried to start to look at that, but we haven't made a whole lot of progress. But I would say that's also an important aspect, especially for, say, small and medium-sized businesses.
Okay, thank you. So we have one last question on the line, and I'd encourage anyone who has other questions to type them up right now. One last question from Paul. I understand that the BCEGS ratings are updated every 5 years, and the program has been in place for more than 20 years. You mentioned large variation in ratings from one community to another. Do you know if ratings for communities vary much over time?
So, yes, but I can't answer specifically by how much. I mean, that's an interesting question, just to sort of look at certain communities and how they change over time, and to try to understand why that is. I mean, we have also started some other work looking at what drives participation and the ratings themselves, right? Like if you start out at a 9, why are you, 15, 20 years later, why are you a 3? Like what's driving that? And that's another area of focus for us that we'd like to come back to. And there's been some of that work done there are flood ratings in the US as well. So I think that's also another topic of focus, is just how do the ratings within a community change over time, like the distribution of that and the variety of that, as Paul is suggesting, but also kind of, what's driving that? Why are they going up? Why are they going down? Why are they dropping out? Why are they entering? I think would be really important to take a look at.
Sorry, we have one last question.
Sure.
So, thanks. Have you come across any strategies for creating awareness among consumers about the cost-benefit ratio of resilient buildings?
Not yet, but this is a big focus for us at the Risk Center. We're focused a lot on risk communication, and I mentioned IBHS, where they've for the past 10, 15 years that they've been in existence, that's their focus has been on the science. And now there's a big emphasis being placed on how do you move that science again sort of into practice in a lot of the risk communication parts of that, whether that be on economic effectiveness or other aspects of the risk communication. And so we have work that's looking at that. We're starting out something right now looking at what are beliefs around retrofit mitigation for wind. What do people know about this? What is their knowledge base? I mean, I think we could probably assume it's not very great, but what specifically do they know? Because then that's important when you're trying to communicate to them, and it could be on economics, it could be on other things, but we look at this as really sort of ground zero, where you want to be developing very targeted and specific messages for targeted groups of end users, whether that be for retrofit or even potentially for building codes. And so I think that whole part, I think that whole aspect of it is a big, is a growing area of research. Not obviously we're working on that, but if you look at just other domains like health or smoking, or seat belts or other things, I mean, these are just safety issues. I mean, there's been a lot of messaging and communication around these areas to get to the point to where they are, right? And when you look at hazards, it's just, there hasn't been that much work done. And I think, it's an important part of what we're trying to focus on, and I hope others as well.
Thank you, and I think that's also part of the mission of the work we do at ICLR, trying to get the science out there as much as possible. So this is definitely a priority for us as well. So thanks for this response, and thanks for all the research that you've done and the information you've been able to share with us today on behalf of ICLR and on behalf of several people on the line. So this was a great presentation for us. Thank you very much, and we very much look forward to see where your next research projects take you. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the group?
Just thank you very much for those of you who managed to stick around to the end. Like I said, I hope you found it to be informative. We have a lot of ideas of how we can move this stuff forward. We're always looking for partners and collaborators, and hopefully that's going to be with ICLR, but maybe others who are on the line, especially industry folks who have data that they could potentially share. And I don't know if my contact information will be shared with participants, but like I mentioned, hopefully it would be, and you're welcome to email me or follow up. I'd be happy to take any questions offline, or direct you to some of the things that were asked, like other studies on retrofit or other things. So that's my final thought there.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for this great webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.